Dear colleagues, welcome to the next lecture of the Agroheritage project, which will deal with agroheritage and plant protection issues. Modern human civilization accounts for some 7,000 years. Nowadays, food surplus and lack of famine are taken for granted. We benefit from the achievements of modern agriculture, supported by vast scientific knowledge and enormous industrial capacities. But it's easy to forget that this is true for the last 70 years only. Establishing a sustainable agriculture was a sought-after feature during entire human history. Although achieving this was a tremendous problem, especially during the early stages of human civilization. Sustainability depends on a number of factors and required solving of numerous problems, like soil quality and improvement, use of fertilizers, crop management, local weather prediction, activities for plant protection against elements, pests, and diseases. Nowadays, these problems are more or less under control, but what options were available before industrial era? Ancient farmers had no access to advanced scientific knowledge, industrial supply of fertilizers, pesticides, fungicides, etc. Their only resource were empirical observations, gradually systematized and structured in a set of practices. This empirical knowledge was transmitted between generations in an informal way during day-to-day work. Unfortunately, introduction of modern agriculture practices has substituted this traditional knowledge to a degree when it was mostly lost. One of these lost fields concerns traditional practices related to plant protection and plant health. So, what were the traditional practices for plant protection before industrial era? There are a number of biotic and abiotic factors that can ruin the yield and to bring famine. It may appear that farmers in the past were helpless to them, but it's not true. Of course, some factors cannot be managed, like grasshopper migration, hailstorms, etc. Nevertheless, some practices were established to minimize yield loss. What were the problems these practices dealt with? Natural elements like drought, frost, pests, insects, snails, rodent herbivores, bacterial and viral diseases. How farmers had managed them. Let's start with the plant protection against elements. Farmers were almost helpless against common natural disasters like heavy rains and floods, hailstorms, extended drought, but solutions to protect yield from some of them emerged. Drought. Of course, primitive irrigation was an option, but requires available water source during the entire drought period. In places where water was scarce, irrigation was limited to the most valuable crops or might be afforded by a small group of farmers. Also, irrigation activities required cooperative work and were laborious and time-consuming. Growing crops in arid and semi-arid areas became possible only today due to achievements in science and industry. Frost. Quite problematic in early spring in temperate zone. Can ruin the yield in fruit trees, vegetables, grape, to name a few. A simple but laborious solution was to burn wet hay and or leaves on plot borders during the night. In this case, dense smoke is formed that prevents frost formation. This was practiced in grapeyards, fruit tree gardens, and vegetable plots. Burning wet plant material is still used today, albeit at a small scale due to safety regulations. Plant protection against pests and diseases. During the centuries, few practices had emerged to deal with these problems. While some may be described as chemical treatment, others can be related to now modern ecological approaches. Maybe the oldest compound used in agriculture was the slaked lime. Easily available, it had multiple uses. One of them was for soil treatment. While improving soil quality, this treatment also affects soil microbiome, reducing soil-borne pathogens. When applied on tree trunks, slaked lime deterred herbivores and tree-damaging insects. Slaked lime can also be sprayed on leaves in attempt to reduce pathogenic microflora. Nowadays, slaked lime is included in Bordeaux mixture recipe. Leaf treatment with copper sulfate is a nice example of how traditional practice found its place in modern agriculture. While officially invented in 19th century for prevention of grapevine disease, it was originally used as repellent. Now it's widely used to prevent blight, not only in grape, but in other cultures too. It's interesting that the Bordeaux mixture also contains slaked lime. Thus, one of the efficient modern plant protection agents is actually based on traditional practices. Similar role had the treatment with iron salts. Now the mode of action is well known. It's applied as a solution. Another way was to leave small metal objects in the garden soil, albeit used rarely due to the cost reasons. Today, use of rusty nails in pots can be considered as a distant memory of this traditional practice. Another set of practices toward lowering pathogen load was related to the management of crop residues. A common practice was to burn crop remnant in the field before plowing. Burning destroys pathogenic microorganisms and significantly reduces the risk of disease outbreaks next season. It can also reduce to some extent weeds appearance. Ash delivers microelements to the soil and improves soil structure also to some extent. Today, burning of crop remnants is still used, but under strict control for fire safety reasons. Another approach to reduce yield loss due to diseases was by primitive breeding. In fact, this process has started very early and served as a base for domestication. Actually, domestication is the earliest example of primitive breeding, and first local crop varieties appeared during the centuries, most optimally reflected local conditions. The breeding process further continued in secondary centers. The homegrown cultivars were empirically selected to cope with local pathogens among other traits. The primitive breeding was further facilitated by wider spreading of monoculture fields, especially for grain crops. How? Monoculture allows for fast spread of diseases, but on the other hand, it's easy to spot and select survived progeny for further propagation. Nowadays, these local cultivars are a valuable resource of novel resistance genes and traits. A group of traditional practices might be characterized as ecological. One approach was to grow in vicinity plants that are toxic for pests. An example is ricin. It was used as deterrent for rodents and some insects in vegetable gardens and plots. Quite unexpectedly, the solution was the use of land borders for plant protection. Land borders are narrow stripes of uncultivated land left for legal purposes by landowners. Since they were pulled out from cultivation, these plots were colonized by wild plants and often turned into bushes. These bushes on land borders have formed microhabitats, providing hideouts for pest natural predators like snakes, birds, weasels, etc. Due to the small plot sizes, land borders formed a net in the cultivated area. This net allowed for sufficient control of mice and insect populations. in the arable lands, thus increasing the yield. Nowadays, land borders were mostly eliminated by agroindustry. Achievements in geodesy, especially GPS, also contributed to their near disappearance in small private plots. Remnants could be found only in regions where land consolidation was not performed. To some extent, land borders could be replaced by non-cultivated neighbor areas that are difficult for processing, like riversides, ravines, etc. Another approach for plant protection was by improving the plant health. Plant health is a complex condition that depends on a number of factors. Soil quality is the first key parameter. It includes soil structure and soil composition. The first parameter was soil structure. Manual digging and invention of plowing resulted in improved soil aeration, faster organic degradation, and better water retention. The role of fertilizers was recognized very early in agriculture history. It was noticed that fertilizers allowed growth of healthy plants and that healthy plants are less susceptible to diseases and in some cases to elements. On the other hand, these practices facilitated growth of not only crops but weeds too. Since weeds can quickly overgrow cultivars, their removal was the first strategy to ensure high yield. During the most of human history, weeding was performed either manually or by plowing where possible. Despite being laborious and time-consuming, weeding was absolutely necessary to secure sufficient yield. In modern agroindustry, traditional weeding was replaced by herbicide treatments. Nevertheless, traditional weeding is still a standard practice in small farms where mechanization cannot be used. Also, traditional weeding is the practice of choice in organic farming to avoid herbicide use. Another traditional practice was crop rotation. It was noticed that growing same crop on the same plot for several seasons greatly reduced yield and plants grow weaker despite applying fertilizers. The effect does not occur when different cultures is grown each season. Crop rotation was invented very early in agriculture history, probably independently at several locations. In medieval times, it was a mandatory rule, sometimes enforced by law. Nowadays, crop rotation is a standard practice in agroindustry. This brief overview demonstrates that ancient farmers were not absolutely helpless against natural elements, pests, and plant diseases in their efforts. While most of the negative factors were, and some of them still are, almost impossible to control, empirical observations gave rise to some practices to protect and improve plant health, thus preserving the yield. Some of these practices, like crop rotation, weeding, burning crop remnants, Bordeaux solutions, were inherited by modern agriculture. Others, like land border use, were once abandoned, but are now revived, albeit at a new scientific level. The topic was also an example how reviving traditional practices can help modern agro-industry. Thank you for